Thank you, Brian. Friends, Amsterdammers and country folk, I come not to praise Garret Hardin, but to bury him. And as you can probably imagine from Brian's introduction, he was a little nervous because I chose a non-social scientist for discussion within a social science faculty, and also because I chose someone who's not my hero, and probably not the hero of many of you here in this room. So let me just try and backtrack a little bit. If you look at the global ecological challenge today, there are two issues that stand central. The first is there global consensus on the science of environmental problems? Is there recognition of limits? And the second one is, if there are limits, what are the values by which we allocate rights, responsibilities, and risks to different people all over the world? Now, Garret Hardin was one of the first people to recognize limits or scarcity of the environment, but his choices with respect to how we allocate rights, responsibilities, and risks, those choices are very problematic in my view. So, what I'm going to discuss today is why Hardin. I'm going to talk about Hardin as a person, his publications, his seminal work, the enduring influence of his work, and why I, and many of you probably, disagree with his work. So the issue is Hardin great? Is he relevant for social science? Is he a hero? So one of the things that Hardin brings up in his literature is the recognition of limits. For example, he talks about the fish populations of the oceans, and that he sees ruin lying ahead, and that no technological invention can prevent this fate. In fact, all improvements in the art of fishing merely they hasten the day of complete ruin. And so he brings this topic up, and the question is that still relevant today? And what we can find is that if you look on Google, for example, you'll find a number of different PowerPoints which talk about how badly our fishing systems have been affected. And in fact, in the Global Environment Outlook of 2019, this particular document confirms many of the things that Hardin talks about. For example, it confirms that in the area of air, land, freshwater, oceans, and biodiversity, we are moving into a very red system, a very irreversible system, and all these systems are likely to have irreversible impacts on human health as well. So in that sense, Hardin is extremely relevant even today, and his intellectual legacy lives on in the Garret Hardin Society and, for example, the Californians for Population Stabilization. But why Hardin? He's not a social scientist. Hardin studied microbiology and ecology, and most of his work, however, is not so much focused on the ecological aspects as it is focused on what causes the environmental problem and how should we solve it. So he focuses on the ethics of problem solving at all levels of governance, local, national, and global. And in that sense, he is, in a sense, a social scientist. However, he is clearly not my hero, and I'm hoping he's not any of yours hero either. So, let us assume that he's right, and the GEO is right, that there is a shrinking environmental space. If you're a neoliberal capitalist, you will solve the problem by using pricing, markets, privatization, and basically use the economic system to allocate resources. If you believe in hegemonic power and the role of hegemonic power in allocating resources, then you'll probably go towards absolute territorial sovereignty or towards the securitization of environmental resources. And if you decide, like Elinor Ostrom, that you want to look at it from a governance perspective, you might come up with polycentric governance approaches. Finally, you might also, if you're a cosmopolitan, look at it from the perspective of sustainable development, a transformation agenda, and maybe come up with something like the Sustainable Development Goals. Hardin, however, is your typical hegemonic thinker. So he thinks very much within the scope of US nationalism. And he basically comes back to this issue of how do we share these scarce resources by arguing there is not enough to share, sharing is suicidal. He also says the fundamental error of the sharing ethics is that it leads to the tragedy of the commons. And Hardin, who is he? Well, Hardin was born in Dallas, Texas. His father was a railroad employee. As a child, he suffered from polio and had a limp. He also won an academic scholarship and a drama scholarship. And then he had to choose between two careers and chose eventually academia. He moved on to the University of Chicago and got a zoology degree, a PhD from Stanford in biology, and became full professor of human ecology at Stanford in 1961. And then earlier on in this century, he committed suicide with his wife, and he had 4 children. The reasons I'm bringing all these things up is because they actually influenced, to some extent, the way he thinks. Now, Hardin was a prolific scholar, so he wrote several books. And basically, if you look at the themes that come up, he talks about the environmental crisis and the limits. He talks about population growth. He talks about immigration and aid. So those are the repeating narratives that keep coming up in his various books. He also wrote 2 very famous seminal papers, The Tragedy of the Commons, and last year was 50 years after that paper was written, and Living on a Lifeboat, which was written in 1974. But the themes in those papers come back over and over again. Now, Hardin, his narrative about the tragedy of the commons was inspired by William Foster Lloyd's pamphlet. So, in fact, he took an idea that was already there in the scholarship, but he gave it much more focus and emphasis. What is the tragedy of the commons? Well, you have a common area where animals graze. The herders benefit when their animals multiply because they have more animals and they can benefit from the productivity of more animals. But each time individual herders make that decision, that could lead to a situation in which the commons are no longer able to support all these animals. And therein lies the tragedy. Each man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit in a world that is limited. And so basically, he is arguing in favor of a number of solutions. And his first solution, of course, is enclosing the commons, privatization, you could argue. He also very clearly focuses on abandoning human rights and the UN approach to human rights issues. He talks about population control, but also implicitly in many places about technology control. And then when he talks about dividing these scarce resources, he focuses clearly on America first, no sharing with the rest, no migration, no compensation for Native Americans, and the need for mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. On human rights, he has a problem because during that period, human rights had come onto the global agenda and they had been adopted. But if you take a human rights approach, then most of his other conclusions become invalid. So he had to question the human rights approach. And therefore he says, if we love the truth about the world, we must not only deny the validity of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and he goes on. So basically he tries to destroy the fundamental validity of notions of human rights. Although he acknowledges that the damage that innocent actions by individuals can inflict on the environment. So basically he sees it as an innocent action of people, but it's primarily because everyone can innocently cause damage that recognizing human rights would create, therefore, a major problem. So this leads him to focus, like Malthus, on population growth as the major cause of all issues. And then he talks about this euphoria of the benign population transition, which he doesn't see as logical, as happening. And he focuses on the fact that maybe it's very difficult to find technical solutions to this population problem. And of course, many people, if you look at the internet, you'll find that many people actually see a huge problem in the population growth statistics. So they don't show you that it eventually may stabilize. They think of it as something that can keep becoming a big problem. And as a result of that, he concludes, freedom to breed is intolerable. And basically, from the gender perspective, he would like to constrain the freedom of women to make their own choices. And that's a general story that he makes. But he also comes back and then focuses on his nationalism. And he says, without a world government that is sovereign in reproductive matters, mankind lives, in fact, on a number of sovereign lifeboats. For the foreseeable future, survival demands that we govern our actions by the ethics of a lifeboat. And that brings me to lifeboat ethics, which in today's parlance would be America first. Basically what he says is that some of us are living on a lifeboat. There are people outside swimming trying to get onto the lifeboat. We have a number of choices. Choice 1, we allow them in and the boat sinks. Choice 2, we allow some in and make rules as to who we allow in and who we don't allow in. Choice 3, we allow no one in. And basically what you see from this is he is not in agreement with choice 1 or choice 2, and I'll explain the choice 2 later. He wants to go for allowing no one in. And he argues that if you feel guilty, get out and swim and let someone else in. And then the net result is that on the lifeboat, we have no guilty feelings because everybody is on the boat now, doesn't want anybody else to come in. And that's his solution for solving the environmental problem. This brings me to the issue of development cooperation or aid or sharing with the rest. And then he says that people who promote development cooperation will argue, but it isn't their fault. How can we blame the poor people who are caught in an emergency? Why must we punish them? The concepts of blame and punishment are irrelevant. The question is, what are the operational consequences of establishing a World Food Bank? And if you think further, he concludes that the operational consequences are more babies, more people. And that's a problem. And so he argues against help to poorer countries. And he said food aid and all kinds of foreign aid is really become a problem. And it has become a habit that can apparently survive in the absence of any known justification. And he looks at a lot of data to make this claim. And then he says, every life saved this year in a poor country diminishes the quality of life for subsequent generations. And furthermore, he argues that we don't have the right to be generous, because to be generous with your own possessions is one thing, but to be generous with the posterity's possessions is quite another thing. And therefore, is it not desirable that at least some of the grandchildren of people now living should have a decent place in which to live, and the rest don't count? So, this boy died, and his sacrifice means that his children and grandchildren that could have come if he had lived will no longer be a pressure on the earth's resources. And if we had saved him, we would have caused problems for our children in the Western world or in the US. So then this brings me to the issue of immigration. And there too, he spends a lot of time talking about whether immigration is useful or not, and whether it is justifiable or not. And he says that some people justify it for altruistic reasons, and others justify it because they say that immigration allows for cheap labor, and that helps business and industry. But of course, immigrants bring families. So how do you shut the door? Because immigrants will say, I want to bring my father, I want to bring my mother, I want to bring my wife, I want to bring my children, I want to bring my cousin. When do you shut the door? And that is the tragedy of immigration. The issue of how and when you shut the door. And of course, he also discusses Native Americans. And here it's really interesting to see how honest he is in what he writes, because he says, it is literally true that we Americans of non-Indian ancestry are the descendants of thieves. Should we not then give back the land to the Indians? That is, give it to the now living Americans of Indian ancestry. As an exercise in pure logic, I see no way to reject this proposal. Yet, I am unwilling to live by it, and I know no one who is. And then he continues to say, suppose becoming intoxicated with pure justice, we Anglos should decide to turn our land over to the Indians. Since all our other wealth has also been derived from the land, we would have to give that to the Indians too. Then what would we non-Indians do? Where would we go? There is no open land in the world on which men without capital can make their living, and not much unoccupied land on which men with capital can either. Where would 200 million putatively justice-loving non-Indian Americans go? Most of them, in the persons of their ancestors, came from Europe. But they wouldn't be welcome back there either, right? And if he was a European, he wouldn't want them to come back either, correct? So he is stuck in this narrative, and therefore at the end of this process, he basically concludes, don't compensate the Native Americans, because that's not going to be feasible and affordable for the white Americans, the non-Native Americans. And so basically he comes back to the fundamental error of the sharing ethics is that it leads to the tragedy of the commons. And I try to relate it to a current day cartoon which says, I am the 1%, Smithers, release the hounds. He concludes, injustice is therefore preferable to total ruin. And you can see that narrative coming back today in rising walls, in registration of populations so that you can control who is a national and who is not, where you have to prove that you're a national, or in allowing people to drown. When he talks about the tragedy of the commons, he presents that as inevitable. Because it's common, the common climate, the common atmosphere, the common waters, the fish, because it's common to everybody, everyone is grabbing it. And as technology increases, they grab more and more of those resources. So there's an inevitability in that tragedy. And I think that's not entirely true. I think this is a puzzle. It's a puzzle that we all have to solve. And what is really the tragedy at the global level is the tragedy of inequality. And the tragedy of inequality is that the resources and the sinks, that is where we dump our pollution, they are reducing on a per capita basis and on a per use basis. So the question that arises is, how do we allocate these while we live still within the carrying capacity of the earth or the carrying capacity of local ecosystems? And the tragedy of inequality is that there is inequality in who causes the resource extraction and pollution, in who suffers, in who has power to address these problems, and the competition between Hardinian and cosmopolitan values. What I do agree with him about a little bit is the need for mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon by the majority. I think when he was writing, the majority was slightly different than today. In the global economy today, the majority are developing countries, so you'd get a completely different narrative, which probably he would not agree with, but that narrative has to some extent buried the Hardinian value system, because we've got the Sustainable Development Goals with their basis in human rights approaches, in trying to emphasize that you should leave no one behind, in global justice storylines where the social issues are emphasized and population challenges are not dealt with simply in terms of it is intolerable to allow women to breed. That is the global consensus in terms of the value system we have. It's not yet hard law, but it is there in terms of consensus. But there is an underbelly response. And that underbelly response is, we really can't share. We don't want to share. And there are many people in different parts of the world that keep coming back to this underbelly response. And that is why it is so vitally important to understand what Garret Hardin is arguing and why he is arguing that. Because if we can understand what he is arguing and why it is such a persistent argument, then maybe we can try to address the challenges of the earth. And that brings me to my conclusion, remarkably much earlier than I had thought I would reach it. And basically, the conclusion of my presentation is that Hardin has a fairly accurate assessment of the problem, because he talks about various types of resources and various types of pollution problems, and in each of these he comes back and concludes there are limits. And those limits are today still the subject of discussion, whether they are in terms of limits or in terms of scarcity. So he's got that part of the narrative fairly well under control. He also explains, I think, the ethical dilemma very clearly, because he tries to struggle with all the elements, whether it is the value system, the ethics, justice norms, human rights approaches, and then how these translate into policies on aid, policies on migration, and policies on local indigenous communities. He does that quite well. He brings all the arguments in a very, very honest manner to the front. And he repeats them and deals with them with empirical data, sometimes in different papers. Not always. Many of his papers are just argumentative. But the problem that I have with his work is that he comes to conclusions that I find completely and totally inappropriate. His conclusions are, we don't need justice in this world, we just need to survive within the carrying capacity, and the we is the American. Occasionally, he expands the we to include the rich world. But what he doesn't want is those poor people in the boats outside coming into the rich world. And even if we are the descendants of thieves, as he says, and acknowledges the role of developed countries in accessing resources from the south, he is unwilling to share it with anybody else that he doesn't relate to. So his conclusions, from my perspective, are very, very problematic. You could conclude that with the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals and their commitment to leave no one behind, Hardinian values are now dead. And yet, as we speak, people are dying in the Mediterranean or in crossing borders in different parts of the world, whether it is in Asia or Africa or Latin America or into the United States, and other people are watching, and the walls are going up. And I think the big challenge for all of us is, how do we find a convincing narrative that doesn't come over as purely normative, thou shalt be good, but that comes over as convincing people of the need to address the social justice issues because we are human and because it's absolutely essential to address these issues in order to be able to address also the environmental problem. And to try to come up with this counter-narrative that will sell to the Trumps, to the Wilders, and to those who believe in Brexit is going to be a really big challenge. And I think I'm going to leave it over there, and I'm happy to take on questions regarding his legacy.